perhaps while we're going with this. The question is where is my meta screen to show up? Let's do this. There we go. Haha! Okay. So let's just look. I can do a kind of a soft sound check on that green bar there. I think you can hear me. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the DVA here in Greensburg, and this is the Phalcon Meetup of Western Pennsylvania. Lots of video and lots of smiling faces. So we have two presentations. I'm going to give one on Zephir, which is a compilation tool for converting PHP-like languages to C extensions for PHP. It's kind of the underlying power that gives Phalcon its performance. And then we're going to hear from Zach Murphy, who's going to talk about web accessibility. So that one, we'll get kind of a broader view of just good general web practices. So to get things started, let's talk about Zephir. So Zephir is a language that was invented intentionally for the purposes of trying to fit this kind of hole in the PHP ecosystem while PHP naturally is interpreted and can be compiled to bytecode for efficient execution. There was kind of this missing area where we needed to be able to kind of make C extensions, which has always been something that the Zend engine has supported. And so since PHP 4 and 5, and then especially 7, we have Zend engine access, and in almost every place that PHP is deployed, there's Zend available. And so that gives us the ability that if we knew C, and we knew enough about the internal workings of Zend, we could write very efficient code to handle a lot of our processes. So the reality is that finding a C programmer these days is somewhat hard, right? And the concept of interpreted languages for developer speed has kind of become very vogue, even to the point where we have languages like Java, which in its own right is run in a virtual machine that tries to achieve compiled-like speed, but is interpreted. So we need a middle ground, and Zephir kind of acts as that middle ground. So some of the important things about Zephir is that while it's PHP-like, it does incorporate some compiled language concepts that aren't available in PHP. It has a type system, but it's not a required type system. So that means that if you want to say this is an integer, or if you want to say this is a string, that's your choice. But you can also define variable types. That can be a little bit confusing because this is a compiled language, we also introduce some concepts of immutability. And so how you define your variables defines how they can be rewritten. And so that's something that the normal PHP engineer may not be as familiar with. It has memory safety. So being compiled, that means that instead of us dynamically allocating memory within the AST for our code before it's executed, there's actually memory management happening in the background. And of course, what that means is we now have the ability to say, I know how much memory I need, how much memory gets allocated, and then when it gets deallocated. So we get garbage collection as a result. But the side effect of this is that we don't allow for pointers, right? So there's no direct memory access, which means that it's still relatively safe. Unlike C, where there's a lot of opportunities for buffer underrun and overflows when we're directly accessing memory. The compilation model is ahead of time, so it's AOT, and that is, of course, in direct kind of like difference to the way that PHP is written. So that can be kind of a struggling point to start with. If you're familiar with things that are compiled, like C, C++, and any other series of languages in that category, this is not going to be too weird to you. But it does provide some opportunities for like some engineering planning, especially if you're going to do this on a large team. And then the memory model, which is that it's task local garbage collection. So we're going to have relatively good in-memory efficiency when using this. So let's talk about AOT versus JIT. So ahead of time versus just in time. So probably the important factor here is in the old days, when we were really worried about resource allocation and memory management because we didn't have a lot of resources, or a very low amount of memory, almost all languages were compiled because it was the only way to really assure that efficiency. Plus, we hadn't developed systems that were fast enough that they could handle this constant interpretation of our code to allow it to be just-in-time compiled. So let's kind of idea, in case you don't know what AOT and JIT kind of look like, I have a couple of images which I think will help you understand the concept further. So, this is ahead of time, also known as the gas station sandwich. So, it's already made, you just come in, pick it up, and you eat it. You consume it, without any additional work required. JIT, on the other hand, is the parts of a sandwich, right? You go to the store, you get the bread, the meat, the cheese, the lettuce. Collect all the stuff ahead of time, and then you make the sandwich right before you want to eat the sandwich. So that's my very simple analogy to these two kind of pretty simple computer science concepts, just in the event that you haven't encountered them before. So let's talk a little bit more about how AOT and JIT has affected the kind of like PHP community in general. So really, if you think about it, interpreted languages are all kind of just-in-time compiled, but because every line of code gets reevaluated from its PHP language to whatever its intermediate language or directly to the compiled language that gets executed by the machine, that can encounter some opportunities for inefficiency. Now, the goal here is to, over time, to provide a certain layer of caching or efficiency so that if you didn't touch the line of code, then there was no reason to essentially recompile the line of code. Now, this, in the end, allows a language that could be kind of slow at runtime to be a little bit faster in your production environment. And so there's lots of concepts in PHP that we're all familiar with, like object caching, where as each particular part of the PHP code runs that can be identified as non-dynamic, then that code can be left aside to be executed from a like a static context later. And this is really similar to the way that Java compiles things. Now that was not necessarily part of the runtime, and so the big conversation that's been going on is that the new version of PHP should include its own concept of JIT natively. Well, there's still some efforts to be done there, and it should come pretty soon. In the meantime, there's nothing really wrong with us trying to do the ahead-of-time compilation. So even other languages that rely on virtual machines or just-in-time compilation, there's still a concept of ahead of time. There's still some concept where it's efficient. And it's a ooh, coffee shops are the best, by the way, because they have coffee. Yep. So one of the goals is that if we can deliver something that's ahead of time compiled, then we can make that platform specific. We can take advantage of whatever optimizations are available for that platform, and we don't have to have any of the compile time components available to that machine in order to run our code. Which means that, in some cases, deployments can be easier. So there's a back and forth here. There's a big push in PHP for JIT to be a native tool. And that's a lot where Hack and HHVM came in as a server infrastructure, where they kind of added that feature tangentially to the language. Whereas Hack and HHVM do not execute native PHP, they execute their own kind of variation, but they're compliant. We're looking for that to be available in the standard Zend supported PHP runtime. And but this is how it works. We do a lot of side development, and so where the HHVM and Hack people have done a pretty good job of identifying locations where JIT is efficient. This is an opportunity, though, in Zephir to do PHP compiled into an ahead-of-time compiled construct. So let's talk about some use cases for specifically ahead-of-time compiled items. So one of them is obfuscation. And I'm going to say this only in the sense that it's true, but doesn't mean that this should be a goal. So there's nothing wrong with using a compilation tool to make it so that the average person can't just open your code and read how it works. Now, this is obviously an improvement over PHP, that if someone can get into your code base, then they might be able to see how you implement a certain security practice. And that you could add a layer of protection, security through obfuscation, in a sense. This indirection would let you be able to hide some of that implementation, possibly in another part of your server that might be harder to get to or more secure, or just so that you can distribute it, if it's a commercial product, with less likely of some kind of espionage or theft of your intellectual ideas. That said, that does not mean that your goal should be to always compile all of your PHP code to keep anyone from copying it. Because it just doesn't have a lot of value, and you're going to end up putting a lot of work on yourself to get it to that level. But there are certain reasons that might be used. Now performance, that's a big one. So whether it's JIT or being interpreted live, ahead of time means that both those processes have already been handled. So you're going to get likely the best performance you're going to get out of your code. Of course, the performance is still limited by the kind of activities you're taking. So there are certain kinds of things that no matter how well you write them are going to be slow. Now, there is a certain amount of benefit you can get from using a ahead-of-time compilation model, especially if you have a specific architecture that you're building for. Because that means that we're passing through CLang, we can utilize system-level optimizations, which will effectively rewrite some of our code syntax to make it efficient for the CPU special runtime instruction sets that are available. That is really kind of the magic of the ahead of time when it comes to you knowing where your platform, what your platform is. Now, that said, that means that you have to build an independent runtime for each architecture you're targeting. But that's been the constraint of every compiled language developer since the beginning. So I wouldn't say that that's too strange. Now, that's where it leads into portability. So we can take the code compiled for the common Windows runtime and then run it on some other Windows server. Because it's likely that they're all going to have the same access to the same instruction sets. They're all going to use VC something as their C++ add-on for the kernel. The same is true for your Linux distributions. You can have generic or targeted specific ideas, or platforms, but you can still move that code around. All right, so here's where Zephir is really not going to help you. So I mentioned that it doesn't matter what you do, sometimes your code is just going to be slow. And these are kind of constraints that don't matter how you compile it. So code that relies on blocking I/O. And what I mean by that is we're talking the web. So let's say that you decide to get a file from another domain over an HTTP protocol. No matter how fast your code is, you're still going to wait for that connection to be established, the headers to be sent, for the body to be sent, and for the response to be received and processed. No matter what, it's going to be that fast. And so realistically, I would not recommend using Zephir as a goal towards compiling code which has a significant amount of blocking I/O stuff. Reading from disk can also be this sometimes, but as long as that operations stay local, there's usually optimizations which will make this worthwhile still. But computationally heavy applications in the opposite of I/O operations will definitely see the biggest boost, because that's usually where the special instruction sets on the CPUs take their effect as to make math operations more efficient and other bit manipulation operations faster. Code that has heavy churn. So this has more to do with people than it has to do with your code. So when I say churn, I mean that a bunch of people are going to be touching it constantly. And so when you're dealing with a compiled compilation unit, there's a little bit more overhead in man effort to compile that code and to define all the individual targets and then to move that to wherever it needs to be deployed to. And while all that stuff can be automated, the more often you have to do that, the more difficult and more time-consuming it can be. So code that often has heavy churn, heavy change sets happening to it quite a bunch would be probably, I would say, not a good candidate. Now, the way I look at this, though, is that when new code starts up, sometimes it gets a lot of churn and then it becomes stable. It's when that code becomes stable that it now becomes a candidate to be compiled into a ahead-of-time compiled library, because we don't really need to change it that much anymore. And so we won't have to worry about that overhead any longer. Now, the other one is code that makes a lot of calls to like native PHP source. And the only reason is that if you wrote a C library that then ends up just calling a bunch of PHP code, you really haven't done yourself any favors. If it's just acting as like an intermediary, it's probably likely that the whole thing being compiled or just written in PHP might have been better. Now that's an exception again. Now if this is like, I have a high churn bit of PHP that I'm going to continue to call, and then eventually it's going to migrate into the rest of my code base, that's a little bit different. But it's definitely a top-down concept that you process most of your requests through your compiled code, and then there's some PHP code at the bottom which will handle the kind of the fine-grained resolutions, right? Where the heavy computational processes will live compiled, and the things that are more or less resolving a web request or putting some strings together, that can happen anywhere. So there's a little bit difference in syntax. Intentionally, Zephir is designed to be almost the same as PHP, and it's actually really easy to get into as a result. But there are some variations. So it's structurally similar, right? Namespace, use clauses. There's a couple of exceptions. For example, anonymous closures can be a little bit sticky, and but all the normal class function, those structures are all identical. Variables, though, are no longer allowed to be dynamic. You have to declare them. Now you have a choice. You can declare them with a type or without a type, and you can declare them immutably or mutably. And that's your choice. And so we're going to go over those two, mutability and immutability keywords, because they don't actually make sense orthogonally, but they're traditionally named this way. So, and then all code must live in classes and contain a namespace. So if you have a Zephir project, Zephir will be a code module under a single namespace, and will have individual classes wrapping all this additional code. Zephir can still access superglobals from the rest of your application, but any of the code you write will need to be wrapped up in some kind of OO concept for it to be valid. So this is a quick example, just to get you started, of what two of the variable naming conventions are. So I'm not going to do the static or the type-specific version, because if you've done any kind of type language, it's the exact same thing. There's nothing new. But we have lets and var. Now, if I said to you, which one of those is probably immutable? What do you think? if I have a let name equals Paul or var middle initial equals K, which one do you think is the one that's mutable, as in can be changed? You think the var would be the one? It's actually the opposite. Yeah, so the var one is immutable, and the let is mutable. I know, it seems silly that something called variable is invariant, but that's the only thing that'll catch you up. Everything else you'll find pretty friendly, and the documentation for Zephir is really kind of nice and succinct. So you know a little bit about how the command line works, since it does have a command line tool. And you can get a project running, and you can get something compiled. So I'll tell you about a little something if I have a little time here at the end. So here's the getting started process, really easy. The first thing that's kind of troublesome is installing Zephir and the Zephir parser. So Zephir itself will be a command line tool and kind of a compiled runtime. And the parser will be an extension added to PHP, and that's so that we can evaluate code that's written in Zephir against running PHP instance. So it doesn't necessarily have to be compiled in that sense. And then we use the Zephir command line interface. We can say Zephir init, and then we give it a namespace. And this is effectively the same as any namespace, right? It'll be a camel-cased word that represents the kind of code unit you're trying to build. And then once you have some code in there, which the file extensions are .zep, you will run Zephir build. Zephir build is pretty nice because what it'll do is it'll find your existing PHP installation, and it'll actually stick the compiled extension inside your shared directory, whatever's registered. And then you just have to go into your PHP ini file and actually just write extension equals and whatever Zephir said the extension was. So really easy. Now what's cool about this is Phalcon, of course, is compiled in Zephir, and it's an extension. So given, you can build a module which uses code from Zephir, which is compiled, and then you compile your unit, right? So it's possible, and I have a sample in this talk. I have a repository for this talk, which is there, and also posted online, which it basically provides a compiled variation of a controller. So the index controller in any Phalcon is the root controller that accepts right at the domain, the first entry point to a route. So I compiled that, not because it's necessarily a good idea, but it's a great example of how these things can all work together. So my controller that's compiled in my Zephir controller includes the Phalcon controller using a standard use statement, just like we would use in PHP, and extends that controller object. And then inside my Phalcon project, which is now regular PHP, I use the Zephir namespace that I created and compiled, and then I have my controller extend the controller I created. Now I'm not going to muddle this all up with a code example and show you all these steps, but ultimately the point is that I have a PHP application. I've been able to compile a controller, which would be a rather intricate communication between our database and our resulting application, like our end user. And I've been able to find a way to make sure that that doesn't have to be visible. So I've intentionally obfuscated that controller because possibly that's my authentication controller. So there's kind of like that hint back to compilation for obfuscation. But also it just hides the fact that I need that object at all. Or say I need to fundamentally extend the way that Phalcon works, but I don't want to submit a changed Phalcon. It's not really appropriate. I can produce my own compiled series of changes and have them overlaid. So super convenient. Now the cool thing, let's see how much time I have. Like a minute. So one of the things that I find painful about JavaScript and any language that at this point needs some kind of like translation process, because in some ways Zephir is a translation between something that's PHP-like and something that's compiled that would actually distribute. Just like in this movement of WebASM, WebAssembly, where we're going to write code in some kind of higher level or lower level language and then compile it to something the browser can execute. Same concept. So I built a Webpack extension which can watch a Zep extension. So the Zephir extension can be written inside of your Phalcon project. And it will watch for changes in your Zep file and then just constantly rebuild and redeploy that. So, and the way that Zephyr's compiler gives output is very kind of natural to that process, where you get to see kind of where you've made an error almost immediately. So you start typing your code, you hit save on the file, and immediately it either compiles or it tells you which line of code you have to start debugging. And so that's something I'm working on because I'd really like to have a way of having Webpack compile both the public assets like my JavaScript or my style sheets, as well as kind of this dynamic module which will be compiled. But then I don't have to feel that kind of the burn, as it were, of having to constantly hand recompile during development, which really makes that concept of being trapped in the world of kind of like, so I'm almost bringing it back to being almost an interpreted language. And Zep's got a pretty fast compilation process, so it's working pretty well so far. So, you can look for more on that. That's cool. And thank you for your time. Anyone have any questions? Yeah? No? Okay. So Zach, whenever you're ready. Yeah, you need paper adapter? What do you think? What do you think that is?
I have no clue.
I will just power cycle this. See what happens.
Maybe I'll send it to you.
Possibly.
I'll go ahead and get it sent to your Gmail just in case.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Go ahead and plug it in and let's just toggle the video.
I'm sending it to your email right now.
Okay. Of course, it's PowerPoint. I won't be able to run it.
You can do it as PDF?
Well, or we can make Sam do it. Since you have PowerPoint, right? Okay. Oh man, video camera, you are killing me. I'm just gonna go stand over here so the camera will stop doing that thing. So I could probably do a jig or something, Anyways, we're just trying to work through the normal problem of how does someone get someone else's computer hooked up to the projector.
I don't have Sam's email.
Okay,
Yours.
that's
Send it to
me.
you.
Slack to it. Oh, good. Assuming it's not super big. Only 137 meg.
Yeah, ours was nice. $99. Ridiculous.
No, it's like 4 meg. I never understand that size of the average thing.
I'm sure it goes nice in your actually all the pictures.
Well,
Waiting.
yeah, waiting. something like Phalcon's awesome. We really like it. No, but seriously, I really I found Zephir. I want to say this like this. Okay, so I have been doing stuff with software for a really long time, and I've intentionally tried to touch as many different languages and try really to get involved in as many different unusual things as possible, because I really enjoy being a generalist. So when I say to you, I find Zephir to be extremely easy, take that in the sense that I think it's easy.
Same thing.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm not saying you won't find it easy, but it is pretty easy. Like, they have not put a lot of hurdles, and many of the things that thank you. Many of the things that you think should work do honestly just work. And that's what impressed me more than anything else, is that you don't always get that opportunity, where the creators have put something together that just doesn't have a lot of, like, hoops to jump through. So, I'm going to try to get this presentation sent over to someone's computer. Go stand up there, Zach. Wave and tell them about yourself. Like, just go stand in the middle so that they'll stop. So Zach, tell us about yourself.
Right now I'm working for Adelphi as a computer support tech. I just got a job as a systems administrator, so I'll be starting in about 2 weeks. And I graduated from community college and had Paul for my first programming class there.
Oh yeah, that is in fact very much the story, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Alright, so I can't get the Gmail.
What's it doing?
It says 400, there's an error. Your client has issued a malformed or illegal request. Oh, I know, tell me about it. Alright, so I have a PowerPoint and a PDF. Cool.
Nice. Just slowly back to Sam.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Alright, well, I'll send it to her in Slack too, just... Okay, so the thing I learned this week. So setting up all the equipment was easy this time. Get people to send me presentations beforehand. That's what we're going to do this time. That's the next learning strategy thing. Hey, look, it's Sam. Oh, Sam sent me a polite message. Sam polite.
I didn't even send you a Sam.
Oh.
I'm uploading to you over Slack, Sam. It's a PDF.ppx, this says. Did you mean to do that, Zach?
Huh?
Is that what you meant to do? PDF.ppx?
That's what it saved as.
You know, honestly, I actually can open this. I think I can open this in Keynote. Let's see how Keynote takes this. If it doesn't murder it, and I can go into Flex. How's that look? Looking good? All right, we're good. Yeah, we'll do it this way. You'll just need to give me a. I'll just let you page through this.
Okay.
I'm assuming that I haven't really used Keynote very much, but I'm assuming that the.
I've only ever used it maybe once or twice.
I'm assuming the keyboard shortcuts are the same.
Hopefully.
see if this puts it on a weird screen or actually just maintains this.
There we go.
Oh, so you actually can actually set it up on 2 screens for you.
That's nice.
Yeah. Zach, you just need to slide in this way a little bit.
Alright, so my name's Zach Murphy, and I'm going to be talking about web accessibility and using it with WordPress, and also in general. So simple web accessibility pretty much removes barriers to prevent people with different disabilities from using the web so they can access any type of content easily. And there's actually new standards that are supposed to come out in 2018 in January. And it's still a working draft as of right now, and there's actually a live document you can look, and I have a link to that in my slides. And there's different types of disabilities, so you have visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, neurological, and age-related. So there's different tools. Some people use alternative keyboards, which is what that one is in the picture. Different displays, scanning software, screen magnifiers, screen readers, speech recognition, tabbing through elements, and also voice browsers. And there is actually a tool in Chrome, it's an extension called Chromebox, and pretty much reads your entire screen to you off the Chrome browser. And I have a video linked in here, hopefully it'll pop up or maybe not. I can't get it. Hearing disabilities. If you're going to have videos or audio files on your website, you definitely want to have captions. The nice thing about YouTube is most of them, 99% of the time, automatically do the captions, so it makes it a lot easier. But audio files, a lot of times you have to do like a transcript of that. And I actually have someone that I do a website for, they have to do that for all their audio files right now, so that is a pretty big task to do. So that's why usually YouTube is the way to go for video rather than an audio file. And also alternative text, I'm sure we're all aware of what that is when we're coding in HTML. So when you have an image or anything media-wise, you always want to give it alternative text, which is very simple to do. So what happens if you get a complaint from the Office of Civil Rights on your website? So you definitely, if you're working for a business, you want to alert your development team, your administrators, and also your legal counsel. So if you have an attorney or solicitor, and you want to confirm that the problem actually exists, because it could be just something made up on your website, and they will actually give you a date that you have to fix the issue before they actually would like press charges. So they actually give you time to actually work on the issue, and they will actually work with you. And I'm not sure why it's cutting off those words on this. And complaints can be prevented by routine audits done on your website, and there's actually tools you can do to perform an audit on your website and scan for different issues. And best practices for WordPress is to follow all the guidelines to begin with from when you start doing your website, and some content you can grandfather in before they come out with the new rules. So if you came out with the content 2 years before, it will fall under the grandfather policy. And there's also a plugin in WordPress called WordPress Accessibility, which is what I like using a lot. And on certain websites, depending on what theme you use, it'll actually give you a sidebar on the side so that they can actually adjust the contrast of the colors on your website. And also it does text size, and there's a bunch of different options. So here's a few of the different tools right here, and I'll actually do a demo of one. Is it okay if I go in Chrome?
Yeah.
On yours?
It's already open. So the screen you're looking at is not the screen being projected. You have to drag it over.
Okay.
That's all. And you just detach that tab and move it over, and then double click the. You double click the tab or the title bar of the full screen. If you need a hand with that,
I think I got it.
Okay.
Here we go.
Yeah. And double click the black part. Yeah. There you go.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and do my website. Go to it first, and I'll show you what it is actually. So right here I just have different coding lessons on here. I'm still working on doing more. Trying to highlight this call.
Command A.
No.
But it's just, I'm sure it's highlighting, I just don't think you can see it.
No, I'm not getting it.
Okay. Let's get this blocking it. I promise you it's selected.
Okay.
So you need to copy it?
Yeah.
Oh, just go back to the tab and then just hit Command C. Click in there, hit Command A.
Okay.
The cursor. Oh, I'm upside down now. All those video games are gonna help me. Sam knows what I'm talking about.
There we go.
Yeah. Thanks for your patience, Zach.
No problem. And this does take a minute to do that.
Okay.
So I'll actually give you potential problems, and these are actually a couple things I'm aware of and still haven't officially done yet. And I believe this goes off with the new standards that are coming out. And it'll tell you potential problems. Now, a lot of these, when I look through, it has to do with the videos I've embedded from YouTube. So those are already covered from YouTube itself. So these aren't even actual issues right there. But it'll also do HTML validation and CSS if you're doing a website that isn't WordPress and you code it yourself. And that stuff's coming back on there. Just hit enter.
Yeah,
Okay.
just hit allow, whatever it is.
Okay. And there's some other checkers here, and there's also a Chrome Accessibility Developer Tools plugin that'll actually go right in the sidebar, paying for your elements of your developer tools when you do inspect element on a website. And right here I have the link to all the standards, and there's also some other good information here. And I do have a link for this on GitHub.
Nice. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Alright, so you said about getting a complaint and then someone said, like, calling a lawyer against you.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, that seems like pretty, like, that's like over the top.
Yeah.
So what are they complaining about?
Like, let's say someone's blind and they can't view the content on your website like the way they should, they would complain.
They can sue
Yeah.
you?
It could get to that point, but most
Oh,
likely
okay.
I'd say it wouldn't.
That's like the very extreme case,
Yeah.
but they could still make a request legally.
Yeah, they would like file a complaint and then they would get in touch with you about like resolving it.
And so what's that falling under?
Office of Civil Rights. It's
Okay.
like the American Disabilities Act.
So it's I'm trying to decide if it's a criminal or civil kind of thing,
Yeah.
right? Does that make sense? Because well, you want to make your website
Yeah, you
accessible,
want it for anyone.
right? So I'm assuming that this mostly happens with like heavily informational websites that,
Yeah.
that are essential. You need to be able to access,
Right.
and if they didn't meet the guidelines, not
Then
like
you can
my
get wrong.
blog. No one's really missing out on anything on my blog.
Yeah.
Everyone's missing out on everything. No. Thanks, Zach. That's
Yes.
cool. Question, Sam? As always,
Thank
good
you.
work. All right.
Well,
that's it for us this evening. We're going to do a little more chatting here, but we're basically done with presentations, so unlike last week, I'm not going to make you stare at a yellow wall. Plus, it really upsets the camera, so we don't want to upset the camera. So ultimately, we're gonna put the slides up in something, because I know this isn't always super visible over the web, but so you'll get those tomorrow, the next day. So you'll get both presentations plus the audio, like standard conference kind of video. And so, but thanks for joining us this evening, and I hope that you all have a wonderful time coding.